your schedule says that Tanner Smith is going to be speaking. Tanner unfortunately covers 4 states, and so he had to leave yesterday afternoon. So you get the old version. I'm Jerome Otto. I am the market development specialist with Corteva, and I'll tell you the genesis of this talk at the area meetings this past fall. When we were up giving our company updates that we always do, one of the things that we happened to mention was that we had some training modules. And so in discussions with people at these area meetings, it was brought up that this is a good topic for the conference. And so we're going to talk about some of those resources. But first, Taylor asked that I share this story, true story. I live in western Nebraska. And so Monday night, I drove down to Denver. So first thing Tuesday morning, I could be at the airport in Denver. I get through security, I go to McDonald's to get a cup of coffee, and the young man in Colorado, maybe 18 years old, is staring at me very intently, very intently. And I had my North Dakota Weed Patrol hat on. And finally he said, "Dude, you belong to a weed association in North Dakota?" And for just a fraction of a second, I was a really cool old guy like Billy Nelson. But when I explained to him that it was this old leafy spurge, uh, and he instantly lost all interest in me. But for just a minute, I was really cool. Uh, if you're not familiar, Colorado has very liberal drug policies, so there's a certain culture that tends to occur there. Um, in a conversation I had with a gentleman here the first evening I was here, he was asking who Corteva was. And it reminded me that these names, whether it's Enview or Corteva, they may be new to some of you. So I joined Dow Chemical back in 1987. And about 5 years ago, Dow and DuPont merged. And then they took their combined agricultural unit and spun it off into a separate company called Corteva. So I still have to catch myself after 3 decades of saying I work for Dow. I still have to correct myself and say Corteva, but that's who Corteva is. It's a combination of Dow and DuPont, and we merged together. So we are a U.S. based company. And if you're familiar with Pioneer Seed, that's part of who we are. And so that's who Corteva is. If you look at the resources that Corteva brings to you, we have people, Tanner Smith, Mike Otto, our research and development folks that you probably have interacted with over the years. And so it starts with people. Any good company really starts with the people and what we can bring to you. Obviously, products, if you go back to the 1940s when we introduced 2,4-D, and then, Tordon, the triclopyr products, Milestone, uh, High Noon now. So certainly products are a big part. 3-Lex Fastland is a big part of what we bring to you to help serve you and to help you achieve the job that you are looking to do. But what other resources do we have that we can help you with? And I think back to when I was a summer intern in 1984, and I was a farm kid. I grew up on a dairy farm in Minnesota, and I got an internship helping to put on test plots in central Kansas. It didn't take me long to realize that while I may have known something about farming, I didn't know anything about herbicides. Uh, let alone how to read a label. The first time my boss put a 17-page label in front of me and said, "We've got a 2-hour drive. Why don't you familiarize yourself with this label?" It was simply overwhelming. So, and I know a lot of you have a lot of experience, but think back to your rookie year, how much there was to learn. And that's really at the heart of why we put some of these resources together for you. So we're going to go through some of them briefly. So the website, vegetation, MGMT, there's notify your neighbor, some training modules, and then some fire management. And I'm going to be throwing up some QR codes here. If you're interested throughout the presentation, I invite you to grab a snapshot with your cell phone. But if you get back to your offices in a month or so and you think, where did he talk about those resources being available? get a hold of Tanner Smith, Mike Otto. All of these are completely free. And so that's the main thing I want to leave you with is we've got some great resources. They're free and they're available to help train your staff or maybe even you as we go through some of these modules. So again, everything starts with good people and good products. One of the conversations I had last night was how difficult it is to find new help. And then once you find help, it seems you spend the better part of the summer training them. And just as soon as they really get to the point where they're helping you, then they're back to college or they're back to teaching or whatever that is. What if you had some resources that could help you on day one to bring those employees up to speed? How valuable would that be for you? So our industry is ever complex and ever changing. When I think of the changes from 1984 until now, it doesn't even seem like the same industry that I'm in. Just as an example, no one, and I mean no one, was talking about pollinators in 1984. Beneficial forms, I don't remember hearing about that at all. My first 5 years that I was in the job, you were just out to kill weeds. Now you have to kill weeds, and society is demanding that you do these other things as well. So, good products are enough, are a good start, if not enough. So, where do you go for training? Where do you go for education? Spent 10 years covering the state of Wyoming for range and pasture, and I spent a lot of time with the weed districts in Wyoming as they would bring in their summer help, sitting down with them on that first day or two and going over some of these topics that we're going to do here. I would have loved to have had this resource when I was in the field. So let's take a look at some of these resources and see if they might have a fit for you. The first one is a website, vegetationmgmt.com. Pretty much all the products that you would be using, that you'd be interested in your job, can be found here. So there's multiple resources that you can, from here, it'll take you sort of like a thoroughfare. You can exit onto a number of different areas. So talking about things like establishing habitat with your herbicides, the vegetation education modules, and I'll spend a fair amount of time on those because of everything I'm listing on this page. That's the one that I think will have the most function and utility for all of you. Bare ground solutions. I know bare ground isn't a big part of what you do, but some of you deal with that. Biodiversity and sustainability. Have any of you read any articles from the Vista magazine? Is that ringing a bell? Vistas? Okay, a few of you. So there's some good articles in there that go into some deep dives on some of these topics. And then application tips and training. So this is where you can either go to that website, vegetationgmt.com, or you can use that QR code and that will bring you directly to it. And again, from this website, everything I'm going to talk about, if you know where to look, you can get there from here. So this is the one that out of all, yes, Bill? You are one that seems to be okay, thanks, Bill. I'll give that just a few more minutes. Whatever you got. Okay, thanks, Bill. Out of all the things I'm going to cover today, this is the one that I'm the most excited about and the most proud of, just because, again, I wish I would have had this resource when I was doing Tanner and Mike Otto's job. So these are 10, they're free modules, they're self-paced training. And I'll walk you through if you want to. Let's say that you're hiring 2 people and you're bringing them into your staff. Each individual person gets set up on their own training module so they can go through these at their own pace. At the end of each of the modules, there is a test that kind of helps them to ascertain, okay, did you gain the concepts that we're going over here? You don't have to do each of the 10. If you're their supervisor, you can choose which one or ones of them you want them to go through. and in what order they go through. All of these might not be applicable to each of your employees. Again, if you have employee training or some of these, especially when it comes into communication strategies with the general public, some of you who have been around for decades might find some interest in them. I know I did. Uh, each module, depending upon how fast you read and how quickly you take in the information, it takes about 25 minutes per module. So it's not a huge investment in time for you folks. And then as you finish them, it'll mark it as complete. So let's just quickly walk through if you wanted to set up an account, how would you do that? So you can either go to the website, vegetationeducation.corteva.com, or you can go in and snap that QR code. Yes, Bill. Bill's question. Is this a different QR code? Yes. The first one took you to that general website, and if you know where to go from there, you can find this. This takes you directly to the sign up page for those training modules. And again, if you happen to get back, and this happened, we did these fall meetings, and I know that Tanner got a phone call saying, "Where did you say that was?" So if you lose this, if you can't find it, give Tanner or Mike Otto a call. They'd be delighted to make sure and to hook you up with this. So they're free. Has everyone got that? Who wants it? Okay. So when you go to that QR code, it's going to bring you to this sign up login page. And again, let's say you're bringing in two different employees. You could have each of them set up their own account. And so you even have them set up a username. You can use the email if you want, and then an individual password. Fairly simple. Once you've done that, it takes you to the very first one, module one. Did everyone get a chance to go through the exercise yesterday afternoon on the different formulations of herbicides? So that was really enjoyable for me. I don't know who put that together, whose idea, but my hats off to them. I thought that was very well done. So this goes into herbicide mixing, handling, and storage. So some of you may know Mike Otto had his own custom spray business, and he had someone helping him who may or may not have been his dad at 5 o'clock in the morning on a Saturday, who'd been spraying herbicides for 40 years. Okay, no better than this, but it was 5 o'clock in the morning. It was a simple case of Freelex and glyphosate. Without thinking, I thought I had water in the tank. I put in the glyphosate. I put in the Freelex cottage cheese on the bottom of the four-wheeler. It took me 2 hours to get that cleaned out. From a guy who's been spraying herbicides for 40 years. My son had no small amount of fun at his dad's expense. My point is, so imagine you're bringing people on and you want them to know how do you mix herbicides, how do you handle herbicides, and how do you store herbicides. So for those of you that have been in this business for a long time, it's all second nature. But think of all the things you would need to train someone. For example, in that episode yesterday, they talked about the mixing order and how you know what the right mixing order is. For example, always put water in before you add the herbicides. And I tell that story because it's a guy who knew what he was doing. I knew better and I still made that mistake. So imagine being a rookie. But it even backs up before that. Before you ever should start mixing herbicides, you have to know what's the PPE. Well, to do that, you have to know how do you read a label? Where do you find that information on the label? So these are all things that if you're brand new to it, if you think back, maybe if you haven't trained anyone this year, so it's fresh in your mind, think of the amount of information you are trying to cram into that first week of training. So then once you know what your PPE is and where you find that information on the label, and then you know what you're going to be adding in terms of herbicides, and then you know what order you're going to be adding them in. Okay, so that covers all of that, but then the storage and the handling of it. So this goes into things such as don't, and these are things I've seen in my career. You've got a little bit of herbicide left over, let's put it in a Coca-Cola bottle. I've seen that. Uh, I mean, so things you don't want to do, storing it next to feed, storing it next to human food, making sure that it doesn't get wet. So all of these things that are so common sense for all of us who have been around for a long time, it does a great job of going through these. And there's lots of photos. And then again, at the end of it, we've got a nice, just a short knowledge check. I think there are 10 questions that go through just to make sure that that person has an understanding of it. If you happen to be their supervisor and they tell you that they're done, so if you look at these, you will be able to see that on the photo there in the upper left-hand corner, it says completed. As a supervisor, it's a small way for you to be able to know, yes, they've gone through it and they've passed that knowledge check. Module 2, minimizing off-target movement. I've often said the worst tongue lashings I've gotten in my career have not been from producers who are upset that the weeds weren't killed. They've been from people who they believe an off-target movement of herbicides have killed their legacy tomato plants, for example. Any of you who have been on those types of phone calls, you know how emotional those can be. So this goes into what are some of the things that can cause off-target movement, drift, volatility, and then if you're going to talk about drift, someone who's been in this for a long time, you can start talking about how high is your nozzle above the ground, what type of pressure are you using, nozzle type, and how many fine mists do you have? Wind speed, where do you go on the label to find out what type of restrictions there are on wind speed? And then volatility, it talks about what's the difference between drift and volatility. Again, common sense for those of you that have been around for a long time, but think if you're new, trying to get your arms around those. So then volatility, what goes into that? How about formulations? Is it an ester? Is it an amine? Is it a choline? What are the things that we can do? So once we understand all of those, and assuming for a lot of your employees, they may not be picking up herbicides. You're probably doing that for them. But if you're putting them in the field, what are things they, as the person who's either at the end of the hose or operating the sprayer itself, what are things they can keep track of throughout the day? Weather, all of those things that can change throughout the day. So if you combine all of those pieces of information, that goes into minimizing off-target movement. So hopefully by the time they are done with this, they will have an understanding of at least the fundamentals of that, and that can maybe help them and you stay out of trouble. Third one, communicating effectively about vegetation management. So this, I heard yesterday, I forget which talk it was, they were talking about the elderly gentleman who had the pickup truck parked across the driveway because he found out that his farm was in the front page of the newspaper about letting in this new invasive weed, and he was less than happy. So that's just one example, and the person talked about, yes, I learned how not to do it. Maybe that's not something I would have done in the future. So this talks about talking about vegetation management. One of the examples I like to use is if I were to say, I'm not terribly concerned about dealing with a particular herbicide because, the LD50 is over 1,000. How many of you would have some understanding of what the significance of having a high LD50 is? Most of you. Our research has found if you're speaking to the general public and you start using terms like that, not only do they not understand that, it's off-putting because if you're using acronyms that they don't understand, their defense mechanism goes up. So this goes into how do you communicate with the general public? E- Especially fewer and fewer of the general public have an agricultural background. If you go back to 1940, the people who either farmed or grew up on a farm was quite high. The latest statistic I heard is less than 2% of the US population have grown up on a farm, which means they have no direct knowledge of it. And just a quick story to recommend or to highlight that. I was at a conference a month ago and it was down in Colorado, and they were talking about how to take solar fields, engineer them in such a way so that we can graze cattle in those solar fields. Because there's starting to be a real pushback. You start coming in with a 2,000-acre solar field, the general public gets resentful because you're taking that out of production. So the idea was, what if we could take the solar engineers and cattle producers and bring them together? And so the engineer told the story that this was her, and this is a woman with a PhD in civil engineering, a very, very bright person, no cattle background. She told the story that she was in her third day with this meeting with the cattle, and she's representing the solar manufacturers. And she was saying that she had asked them early on if they were using AI, and she was amazed to know they've been using AI for decades. And she had no idea that cattle producers were using AI. 3 days later, they each realized one was talking about artificial intelligence, the engineer. The other was talking about artificial insemination, the cattle feed. And so small and humorous, but she said it would have saved a lot of time had I understood that AI had two meanings. And just an example of how there's things that in the agricultural industry, there's acronyms, there's terms that we take for granted that general public does not know. So with that in mind, it goes through about some of the do's and the don'ts. And one of the questions when I was looking at area meetings this fall, somebody asked, is there anything specifically dealing with how do you communicate to the media? And it's not titled as such, but I'm going to suggest this type of training is good for you to talk to the media because, in my experience, more and more the media do not have agricultural backgrounds. So the more that you can communicate in a way that is understandable, the better off we're all going to be in terms of doing those communications. Wheat resistance. So this, and I always tell the story when I was a summer intern in 1984 in central Kansas. I was listening to a couple of university researchers, and this brand new class of chemistry, so exciting, called sulfonylureas was introduced. And I remember two of them in central Kansas, the university researchers saying, kosher control will never be a problem ever again. We have fixed kosher control. And that was true for about 10 years or Bill, I don't know how long. It was true until it wasn't, even then. So if you take, I was going to throw a slide in here, but if I'm sure you've all seen it, the number of documented weeds that have weed resistance in the U.S. has just gone, it's a parabolic curve. And so it's going to continue to be a huge concern. So this is a really complex topic. This breaks it down pretty simply so that if someone's brand new, they're going to walk away with a fundamental understanding of what is weed resistance, what's the difference between something that never did control it versus it used to, but it doesn't now, and then what plays into the management of it. So modes of action, tank mixing, rotating, how does the potential weed resistance, and then strategies that you all are using every day in your job to try to compete with this. Number five, why do herbicides sometimes fail? And again, quite frankly, as a rookie back in 1984, I wish I would have had this because it goes through just some basic things. There's some of the ones that are very obvious. If you ever have a producer who comes in and says, purchased product X from you and it didn't work, first thing you're probably going to tactfully ask them is, tell me what your calibration, how much did you put into the tank? And so it goes into that. And quite frankly, in my experience, many of the non-performance complaints can come down to poor calibration or poor coverage. But let's assume that they've done all of those things right. Then what are some of the reasons why herbicides sometimes fail? And it goes into if your weeds are under stress environmentally, drought, cold, insects, all of those things can reduce the control. And some of the other timing issues that can come in. Maybe if it's best to treat before 12 inches and it happens to be 36 inches. I was having a conversation yesterday with someone and I was recommending to get sprayed before 12 inches. And he said, that's a whole lot easier to do in January than it is to do in May. And it's absolutely true. You get busy, the phone starts to ring. So this goes through some of all of those issues of what can contribute to, even when you're using the right herbicide on the right weed at the right rate and the right time, there's still sometimes that it's not going to work. And it goes through how do you kind of decipher what could have gone wrong? So not only to help explain to the producer, but also then to maybe prevent that from happening in the future. Understanding herbicide toxicity. So this is one, particularly as fewer and fewer of the general public are have any kind of a background with herbicides. This is one that is becoming very important. I know, and this was back 10 years ago in Wyoming, which you'd consider to be a rural state, right? And this was in Gillette, Wyoming. They were telling me that every time they go out with any kind of a 2,4-D amine with that distinctive odor, their phone rings and they start getting into conversations about what are you doing? Why are you doing it? Which has already been covered, but then also, is it safe? Okay. Is it safe for me? Is it safe for my pets? So, in order to explain that, you first have to have some fundamental understanding of herbicide toxicity. How can herbicides affect plants versus people versus, say, dogs versus cows? And then once you understand that, how do you turn around and explain that in language that can be absorbed and understood by the general public? So this can be a really complex issue, but it does break it down into areas and in ways that I think are really understandable. Creating and maintaining pollinator habitat. Again, this is something when I think back to the 80s and even the early 90s, I don't remember anyone talking about pollinator habitat at all, ever. And yet it's difficult for me to go to a large convention and not have a number of these topics on. It's something that the general public is concerned about, and they're really demanding that while we get our weeds controlled, they want us to be able to at least address how we're going to balance this need with the need to control weeds. So it goes into, and a lot of and maybe you run into this, a lot of the general public, when they hear that you're spraying weeds, what's the one herbicide you think the general public knows most of because of television commercials? Roundup glyphosate. So then, if they know anything about Roundup glyphosate, they're assuming that you're wiping out every plant that you are spraying. So even being able to talk about selective chemistry and explaining that in a way that's believable and that's understandable of, yes, it's possible to take out leafy spurge or Canada thistle and you're not going to be killing all the grass. We've got studies that talk about if you are spraying milestone or high noon, for example, 1 year after and 2 year after, what type of forms are going to be left afterwards. And it's way more resilient than what the general public would tend to believe. So this goes into a fair amount of information on that. What is integrated vegetation management and what are the benefits? So this goes into and the cattle grazing in the solar fields. That's an example of how, and just a quick sidebar, I was speaking to the PR person for the solar energy company. And I naively thought that would be the easiest job in the world. It's green energy. Who wouldn't want green energy? I, I told him I thought most communities would welcome solar fields with open arms. And he said that was the case maybe 10 years ago, but as these solar fields are building scale, then there's a growing resistance. People get very resentful that you're taking, for example, I live in Western Nebraska. There is a proposal I just read from a company that wants to put in a 3,000 acre solar field in that part of the country. And sure enough, in the public meeting to discuss it, there were people who were very much in favor of it. Green energy, lower the carbon footprint. There were also people who were very concerned about taking that land out of production. And so it was surprising to me that even in that field, there's conflicting visions and conflicting objectives of what people want to achieve. So this goes into integrated vegetation management. I've heard a number of conversations about using biological controls. Great example being leafy spurge. Many people are unfamiliar that our industry is using multiple tools to address this weed problem. So just being able to go in and to discuss that would really be beneficial when you talk about bringing out biological controls. That's something that people, if they're looking at the North Dakota Weed Control Association, I bet you most people who are not involved are not thinking about biological control. Yet that's an integral part of what all of you are doing. So this goes into the number of different ways that you would take a balanced approach to veg management and what goes into that, and then what some of those benefits are. Wildfire prevention and mitigation. For those of you in the eastern part of the state, this probably has almost no usage. The farther west you go, however, particularly with the invasion of invasive annual grasses, this may be of more interest to you. So this is something that, so I basically covered from Wisconsin down to Missouri and west to the ocean. And I spent a fair amount of time in California, Washington, and Oregon dealing with fire prevention, fire renovation once a fire goes through. And so this goes through just some of the principles involved with how do you keep a fire from getting totally out of control and completely destructive. And once a fire goes through, what are some of the things that we can do to help bring that back to a productive landscape? Pipeline management. For those of you that are involved in veg management with any utilities, whether that's electric or pipeline, there's a specific set of challenges that you have here. And so this goes into some of those challenges, the tools that we have available to us, and then how we would be able to go about utilizing all those tools to achieve the goals that we have. So again, if this is of interest to you, this is the QR that will take you to those websites. It is something which I think has a tremendous amount of utility, whether you have been in for a number of years or whether you are brand new. So the folks on the board thought this would be of benefit to you. And again, if you have any questions when you get home about how to get on, how to get signed up, give Tanner or Mike a call. They'd be delighted to help you. Just a couple of other quick things before we go to break. So notify your neighbor. This is it's a site that was set up specifically for, let's say you're going to be doing some sort of weed or brush control, and you want to speak to the people that's surrounding that. Just let them know what you're doing and why you're doing it. So it's a guide to improve landowner communications. There's a resource guide there. There's strategies, techniques, some key messages that we have found through experience and through research that resonate with homeowners. Effective, there's 5 key sections that dive into those topics. There's a downloadable resource so that if you want to have some handouts, you can have that. And there's also some self-paced trainings to assist you, both you and your employees. So this is another QR code if you happen to be interested in notifying your neighbor. It will allow you then to go and to download those resources that I'm about to cover here in just a minute. Did I get that? Did I miss someone? Okay. Thanks, Bill. Okay. So the first one is notification programs. These are well designed, and some of you may not do this. Think of if you happen to be in an area that's more urban and you're going to be going out either controlling brush or weeds. And we found what you're in on, you're not down on. Meaning if you go to people beforehand, a great example is we're going to control some of the brush, this shine line, because if we don't, and then a storm comes along and comes down, you're not going to have any power. All the meat in your deep freeze is going to freeze. It's going to spoil. We have found something as simple as that. We're controlling brush, so you don't lose power. The benefit to you is you don't have lack of electricity for 7 days. The amount of complaints that those applicators get, if they do that ahead of time, goes way down. So this goes through some of those notification programs. Communication skills. You'll notice that this is the second time I've mentioned this. One of the key things we found is that it's not so much what you are doing, it's how effectively you communicate to the people around you what and why you are doing what you're doing. So, and there's some acronyms there that will help you remember some of the things to do and then not to do. Public interaction. If you have someone who comes up to you or to your employees while they're spraying and says, I'm a little concerned about what you're doing, can you tell me about it? How do you handle those situations? Again, it's effective communication, it's speaking in words that they understand, and it's trying to de escalate a situation. So, this goes through some of the do's and don'ts of how to deal with the general public. Key messaging. If you have it in your head beforehand, this is what I want my employees to say should they be approached. It's much easier to handle it than trying to make it up as you go. So this gives some good strategies and some good messages that we have found to be effective. Habitat benefits. Again, this is going to be one of the key things. Small example, typically what had been done in these utility right-of-ways is they had mowed every 2 years. Well, you know what happens to wildlife when you go through the mower? And we've got studies to show that if we do selective herbicides, the pollinators, the habitat, the wildlife do much better than with the mower. Other things such as your carbon footprint. For those of you that have ever paid to mow along a mile outside, you don't do that for free. It's expensive, and there's a carbon footprint involved with that. So if you can bring those messages to the public and have data to back you up, it really will help reinforce the value of what it is you are doing. And here's some resources that you can download if you're interested. Mike or Tanner could certainly get those sent to you as well. So again, this is that QR code that will bring you to your notify your neighbors. And you see a general theme here. It's understanding, helping your employees understand, and then once they understand it, helping them to effectively communicate to the general public. So that really then will help you to keep the general public aware of what you're doing and the benefits to them of what it is you are doing. So wildfires, again, I know that this is not something that those of you on the eastern side of the state deal with. We're hearing about the devastating wildfires in Maui that took, tragically took a lot of lives. So for the first 3 days, kept hearing it was caused by two things: down power line and high winds, which is true. Those things are true. It wasn't until day 4 that I stumbled across this. There were invasive, non-native grasses there that were not, again, not native to that area. those grasses went up like a tinderbox. And so my point with this is that for those of you that deal with, for example, cheatgrass, if you've ever had fire caused by lightning in a monoculture of cheatgrass with wind, that spreads so fast. And so here's an example, even in Hawaii, where they get a fair amount of rain, if they have invasive species, it can impact fire. So let's talk a little bit about this is a website that speaks directly to fire. And so vegetation.com/fire prevention. Now, a lot of it is forestry related, so that's not going to relate to you. But the ones that deal with invasive annual grasses, particularly on the western half of the state, it may be of interest to you. So we're talking about things that would be of interest to you were annual grasses and fire. And we've got some interviews with some key customers in Idaho, which has very similar topography and rainfall to the Western Dakotas. And so we talk also about things to do before fire and after. So this is the QR code that will bring you to that landing page if you are interested. The amount of fires that we are having in the U.S. is increasing, not only in the number of them, but the severity, the number of acres that are being impacted. So again, you'll see North Dakota is not there, but I'm going to suggest that a part of this is going to have some impact and some importance to you. So break it down into wildfire prevention, things you do before fire. Here's the part that I think may be of interest: annual grasses and fire. And it talks about the unique uh, set of circumstances. If you get non-native invasive winter annual grasses, why that makes it so much worse for fire than if you go back 400 years ago where we had our native grasses. And then restoration. What do you do after a fire that can bring it back? And again, we've got some interviews with people who have had some large scale landscape scale renovation success stories. So again, you look at the people, whether it's your distributor or your chemical supplier, I would encourage you to look at people who have been here for the past 10 years. They will, excuse me, they will be here for the long haul. So pardon me, for Corteva, the people and the products are something I'm very proud of. Also, these types of resources are something which I think could really be of benefit to you. So with that, I'll open it up to any questions we have. Otherwise, Bill, we can go to break. Thanks so much for your time, folks. Appreciate it. So.